Hello, everybody. This is Gary Matheny. Welcome to today's edition of Liberty Observatory, the social, religious, political, philosophical perspective, all with a liberty perspective. Well, thank you for joining me today. Today, we're going to focus in on economics. And specifically, we're going to talk about supply side economics. Most of the mainstream media scoff at supply side economics and call it trickle down economics, when really supply side economics only stands for a very short and easy proposition. And that is that if you have targeted tax cuts, it'll boost the economy. And some would say any tax cut is going to boost the economy because it gives people more spending money. But targeted tax cuts play a more important role than others in boosting the economy. For instance, typically you hear about income taxes. Reduce the income tax rates and you will see a boost in the economy. Well, what is the consequence associated with a boost in the economy? That is that the tax revenue is boosted. In other words, you actually collect more taxes with a tax cut than you do without the tax cut. Now, isn't that a beautiful scenario? Reduce the taxes and you have more tax revenue. And this really happened in the 1980s. Jack Kemp was one of the leading advocates of supply side economics. Of course, Ronald Reagan was a believer in supply side economics, and the tax revenue increased even though they did tax cuts. You think everybody would be on board for that. But part of the problem with the 1980s that there seemed to be this presumption that boosting the economy will result in increased tax revenue, and therefore we don't have to keep too close of an eye on spending because we can get additional tax revenue by boosting the economy. And so in the 1980s, there was no real, in my opinion, sincere effort to balance the budget and reduce our national debt. Then the 1990s came along, and two figures emerged in the 1990s. One was Newt Gingrich, who was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the other one was President Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton gave a famous speech in the 90s where he said, "The era of big government is over. The era of big government is over." And so that put the Republicans and the Democrats on the same page. And they got serious about cutting waste and fraud, abuse in government. They reduced the number of federal government employees. They got serious about working some reforms into the government. And guess what? They also understood to keep the economy humming by keeping taxes low. And there for a few years in the 90s, they did the miraculous. They had a balanced budget. There was more money taken in than going out. That seems so foreign in 2025 that somehow, just a short number of years ago, 30 years ago, that they were balancing budgets. Well, then the 2000s came along. And we have what I call radical spending growth, radical spending growth. And it was for a number of reasons. There was a growth of security measures, partly due to 9/11. We saw the emergence of Homeland Security. We saw the Middle East conflicts, including the wars that we involved ourselves in the Middle East. And then, to make matters even worse, in 2007 or 2008, we had the mortgage market collapse. And that's where, some bright bulb came to the belief that if you bundle mortgages together, if you lose some of those mortgages through non-payment or default, then because they're bundled together with other mortgages, it'll still be cool. In other words, you can still make money. But the problem is that the standard on home loans was reduced so dramatically that there were a ton of houses, or I should say a ton of house sales that basically were defaulted on. And who comes along to bail out the mortgage companies? It's the United States government. So in the 2000s, we had radical spending growth. And then we get up to 2010s, and we have what I call the social justice movement in the 2010s. And interesting, I remember Barack Obama, President Obama, being interviewed on the progressive tax rate. In other words, the more money you make, the higher rate that you pay in the taxes. And it was pointed out to him that the higher tax rate does not necessarily mean increased tax revenue. In other words, somebody was making, a reporter or somebody was making the point that supply side economics makes, and which is basically lower taxes, more tax revenue, because you're boosting the economy with lower taxes. But anyhow, he made the fairness argument in response. In other words, he was not fazed one bit that perhaps lower taxes for all could boost the economy and boost tax revenue. He was more concerned with the fairness associated with a progressive tax rate. In other words, you needed to tax at a greater rate those who were making more money. So that was his tax philosophy. And then you got to add in a few other factors associated with social justice movement in the 2010s, including DEI. DEI starts to emerge in the 2010s, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The equity part makes it very difficult for a free market society, because it starts moving towards the equality of results. Well, in a free market, free society, you can't really move towards equality of results, because people bring different work habits, they bring different assets, different skills, different abilities, and the old-fashioned notion that the harder you work, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it, is set aside for a more entitlement perspective, that people are entitled because they've been discriminated against in times ago. There is this systemic white supremacy, which DEI attempts to address. But anyhow, what you're doing, you're putting another layer on the welfare state, and the welfare state is growing due to the social justice movement. And so basically, we now have what I call the exploding budget debt. In other words, it's way out of control. $35+ trillion in national debt. Every year, we're going not billions of dollars in debt, but every year we're going into additional $1 trillion of debt. And think in the context that we are essentially at peacetime. You could understand during wartime that the debt gets all kind of whack, because it's kind of like, well, we got battles to win and we need equipment to win those battles. So we got to spend a lot of money. Well, basically, if you think about it, we're in peacetime and we still have this exploding debt. Doesn't make any sense. The factors need to change around to reverse that, because no one has really satisfactorily answered the question: what happens when you can no longer pay the interest on a national debt? What if you can't pay that interest? I hear that the interest on a national debt is as large as what we give the Department of Defense. So that's measured in billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. And another factor is that we need to take a look at what can we get our national debt under control. Because like I said, if you can't bring your national debt under control and you can't pay the interest on the national debt, what happens? I know in the private sector, even if you have good relations with a bank, you take a loan and it's secured by a piece of property, and maybe the economy is not any good, and so you make the interest payments on the property. Well, a lot of bankers are like, as long as you're making the interest payments, we're satisfied with that, but when the economy starts turning around, we want you to make payments on the principal. But what happens if you do not make neither principal payments or interest payments? Well, that's when the banks come out and get your stuff. There's collateralized stuff. They'll foreclose on the property. And so it's untenable, and we don't know the answer. No one knows the answer because nobody really specifically seems to know what happens when you cannot pay the interest on a national debt. Well, we're heading in that direction. I guess we'll all figure out. Well, what does Mr. Matheny say about his solution as it relates to the national debt? Well, of course, low taxes. Do what you can to boost the economy. Low taxes, less regulation, freedom-oriented marketplace, boost the economy, and then hopefully the tax revenue will flow in. Secondarily, and this is the one no one ever wants to hit straight on, except for maybe Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich and the Republican Congress in the 1990s, and that is spend less money. Spend less money. Trim the welfare state. What happens is that the more you grow the welfare state, the less incentive it is to work. And I've told people for years and years and years and years, because my experience is in disability law, is that the happiest people I know are those that work. Work. You'll find satisfaction and productivity. It's good to feel a check in your hand on a Friday afternoon. So, but if you got a huge welfare state, it's a disincentive to work, and people sit around and wait for their check, which is a minimal subsistence payment. In other words, you don't really prosper on welfare, but you're not really incentivized to get off of welfare either, because you get all these benefits associated with it: subsidized housing, food stamps, Medicaid, TANF, or whatever, whatever's coming down the pike, you get it. We got to stop subsidizing the welfare state so that more people will work and be productive and have happier lives and pay taxes. Secondarily, trim the military. Okay, trim the welfare state. Let's trim the military. You know, they've got hundreds of millions of dollars unaccounted for that went to the Department of Defense. Hundreds of millions of dollars that they can't really explain what happened to. We do not need to be the world's policeman. If there's anything that we've learned over the last 30 years is that we're not real good at being the world's policeman. So we should stop being the world's policeman, trim our Department of Defense budget, make our defense lean and mean, and have it geared towards protecting us. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. And that is In Perspective, Supply Side Economics.